It's my pleasure to support the tireless work of Burnaby residents opposed to Kinder Morgan expansion, and to be here on traditional Tsleil-Waututh territory. Regrettably, we are not here to celebrate the National Energy Board overhaul or a legitimate review process. We are here because we've been betrayed. Mr. Trudeau knows the board cannot be trusted, and that the NEB torqued reviews, making it easy to recommend approval. The board did this by narrowly scoping the issues, removing cross-examination, refusing to compel answers to information requests, and by not testing the evidence. Mr. Trudeau promised an NEB overhaul. It would apply to existing reviews, and Transmountains would be redone. Terry Beach represents this riding. Last October, he said, "We're going to redo the National Energy Board process." And North Vancouver Liberal MP Jonathan Wilkinson confirmed the Kinder Morgan expansion project must satisfy this new rigorous review. Kinder Morgan is not undergoing a credible review. Kinder Morgan is not undergoing anything. Instead of fixing the process and starting over, Natural Resources Minister Jim Carr appointed a 3-member ministerial panel. The panel traveled the pipeline route collecting impressions in public meetings. The panel has no investigative powers or scientific expertise. It is not able to discern facts from fiction. The panel did not record its proceedings. It is relying on memory and handwritten notes. At each stop, the panel faced complaints. The meetings were poorly administered and poorly advertised. And by the time the panel reached Vancouver and Victoria, and the public was aware of when and where the meetings would be held, many who wanted to speak weren't given a chance. The panel is ill-equipped to perform its task and shrouded in prior conflict of interest. Panel Chair Kim Barrett and Kinder Morgan Canada President Ian Anderson signed a leadership exchange agreement in 2010. Ms. Baird publicly expressed that she and Mr. Anderson are very much alike. They were able to develop a deeper understanding of each other through their business exchange. Ms. Baird played her hand even before public meetings concluded. She wrote an op-ed for the Globe and Mail telegraphing her bias. She said she was hearing 4 themes during the open sessions. She started with the theme of impatience. She said many presenters were feeling because of how long the process was taking. Ms. Baird's claims are not consistent with the facts. Her op-ed was published 5 days after a peaceful protest was held outside the hall where meetings took place in Vancouver. The hall was packed, standing room only. The people that were in the room and the people who spoke were overwhelmingly opposed to the project. Ms. Baird, Ms. Trimby, and Mr. Pennicott know that citizen after concerned citizen, like everyone here tonight, concerned citizens all along the pipeline route expressed how the NEB process failed Canadians. They provided well-researched reasons, and I know some of you tonight here were there, well-researched reasons why the project should not proceed and how the NEB deliberately got it wrong. And yet the panel chair characterized the opposite in a national newspaper. STAND, a non-governmental organization, attended and documented the meetings in BC. They report that 90% of presenters were opposed to the project. Not many were in favor and wanted a speedy decision, but many, 90%, were opposed. Now, public meetings were held in Calgary, Edmonton, and Jasper, Alberta, before the meetings in BC began. There's a summary of these meetings on the Natural Resources Canada website. That summary contradicts Ms. Baird's Globe and Mail piece. The panel's distorted perspective may be influenced by the fact that before public meetings began, its members actively cultivated a petroculture bias. The ministerial panel met privately with Kinder Morgan, privately with the National Energy Board, and privately with Alberta Premier Rachel Notley. In an exclusive interview Ms. Baird gave to Alberta Oil magazine, she called these preferential closed-door sessions pre-engagement meetings. In that same interview, she explained the panel's job. She said, "Our job is to listen to outstanding concerns by citizens. But before hearing citizen concerns, the panel held private sessions with the people most likely to tell it why any public concern the panel would hear are unwarranted and invalid." This is totally unacceptable. We have seen what happened when the NEB held private meetings on the Energy East project. The Energy East panel, along with NEB Chair Peter Watson, had to step away from the process. Now, why has Mr. Carr tolerated private meetings his panel held with Kinder Morgan, the National Energy Board, and Premier Notley? He tolerates them because the fix is in. Mr. Carr actually said that now his panel has allowed more opponents to be heard. This will lend credibility to the government's decision in December. Mr. Carr's panel is window dressing. It's meant to placate protest and fashion credibility. Mr. Carr's panel is not the right process. It is not the process we were promised. Mr. Carr's process is a joke. But Mr. Carr and Mr. Trudeau, we are not laughing. However, Kinder Morgan is. Kinder Morgan is laughing at the Prime Minister and the Liberal government. Kinder Morgan is laughing at Canadians. Just days after the federal election, Kinder Morgan Inc. held its quarterly meeting in Houston, Texas. Ian Anderson was asked by an analyst how the Liberal majority might affect Transmountain's application. And Mr. Anderson snickered. He said, I'm wearing my Liberal red tie." After audible laughter from those on the call, Mr. Anderson continued. He said, "We'll certainly be briefing the Liberal government in due course on the project. We'll just keep them informed and plan to execute the project as soon as we get approval." The lobby register shows just how informed Mr. Anderson has kept the federal government. Between December and August, Ian Anderson reported 31 days when meetings took place with elected officials and senior bureaucrats. Now let's not forget who Kinder Morgan is. Kinder Morgan Inc. is a Texas-based company. It plans to siphon more than $1 billion a year in financial returns away from our economy. Many of Kinder Morgan's largest shareholders are former Enron employees who stack the ranks of Kinder Morgan's board and its senior executive team. Kinder Morgan relies on a complex corporate structure to avoid liability, to avoid spill liability, and to avoid paying corporate taxes. Its chief tax strategist came from Enron. What I will focus on in this presentation is how the NEB parrots Kinder Morgan's false economic narrative and why the NEB report cannot be trusted. The NEB report says that if economic benefits from the project outweigh its residual environmental burdens, the project should be approved. Now, we can put the board's benefits and residual burdens into a simplified equation. And the board identified benefits that were considerable. It said these are markets, a reduction in Canadian crude discount, government revenues, and jobs. Now, they stacked these benefits up against significant residual burdens that they identified as death to orcas and First Nations way of life related to them, greenhouse gases from marine traffic, and then they list freshwater and marine spill as acceptable. If it's acceptable, it has no weight. The board didn't actually use the phrase death to orcas. It said tanker traffic will cause significant adverse effects that will jeopardize their recovery. Sounds like extinction to me. But the board, they waved this off. It decided that since the orcas are unlikely to survive anyway, Kinder Morgan can have at them. The formula shows just how easy it is for the NEB to rig the outcome in favor of approval if it overstates the benefits and callously dismisses the burdens. And that's just what they did. So let's start with markets. There are 13 oil companies referred to as shippers in the report. They have signed long-term take-or-pay contracts. Now, none of these shippers provided evidence to the NEB on where markets in Asia might exist. None said access to new markets would reduce Canadian crude discounts and lead to crude oil price lifts. Offshore markets and a reduction in crude discounts because of them are an invention of Transmountain's consultants, Stephen Kelly of IHS and then Neil Ernest of Muse Stansell. Mr. Kelly was appointed to the National Energy Board prior to the election and while the hearing was ongoing. So after relying on Mr. Kelly's report for almost 2 years, it was stricken from the hearing record. A few weeks later, Mr. Ernest's replaced Mr. Kelly's, and it told a very different market story. Now, the board refused to consider Mr. Kelly's evidence because it was no longer on the hearing record. Now, when it did this, the board did not have to reconcile serious differences about market demand from two consultants working for the same proponent at the same hearing. Transmountain aggressively promoted one view of markets based on Mr. Kelly's evidence and then quickly switched when it received Mr. Ernest's. The board's ruling to strike the evidence meant interveners were not allowed to point to Mr. Kelly's evidence in comparison with Mr. Ernest's to expose Transmountain's lack of market knowledge. Mr. Kelly said that by 2019, about 350,000 barrels a day of diluted bitumen would go to Asia. Most of the rest of it, he said, would go to California. Mr. Ernest told the board, no heavy oil would go to California. Mr. Ernest sent 40% more heavy oil to Northeast Asia instead. Mr. Ernest has a whopping 500,000 barrels a day of diluted bitumen going to Northeast Asia the minute the pipeline opens. Northeast Asia does not receive Alberta's heavy oil currently. There is no market. But according to Mr. Ernest, demand for 500,000 barrels a day of diluted bitumen will materialize by late 2018. And why that's important is that's the minute he starts building these false price lift benefits. They're all based on a market that doesn't exist, on a volume that won't go there as soon as the pipeline's opened. Mr. Ernest didn't have to be accountable. There was no cross-examination at the hearing, and most of the questions interveners asked remain unanswered. Mr. Ernest is Enbridge's consultant, as well as Kinder Morgan's. When Mr. Ernest prepared his report on Northern Gateway, he told the NEB that Northeast Asia would take 290,000 barrels a day of diluted bitumen by 2018, not 500,000 barrels a day, as he did on the Transmountain hearing. It's quite a different story. But just as the board refused to consider the flip-flop in markets from Mr. Kelly to Mr. Ernest, the board refused to consider Mr. Ernest's dramatic differences in his own evidence from one pipeline hearing to another. This isn't the first time that Kinder Morgan has promised the board new markets in Asia. Half a decade ago, Kinder Morgan told the board the same story. Kinder Morgan promised that if the board approved its Firm 50 application guaranteeing dock access, markets in Asia would, with certainty, be developed. So 5 shippers signed 10-year take-or-pay contracts to ship 10,000 barrels a day each to the West Ridge dock. U.S. Oil was the only company that wanted waterborne access to its refinery in Washington. But the other 4, their oil was off to Asia. The board guaranteed access, and it approved a surcharge on those deliveries to create a $280 million slush fund, much of which Kinder Morgan is drawing down to finance its expansion project through regulatory approval. The board bought Kinder Morgan's Asian market story then, and it's swallowing it now. The board didn't bother to check during the recent hearing whether the promises Kinder Morgan made were promises Kinder Morgan kept. If it had, it would know offshore markets have not developed, the guaranteed capacity has not been used, and the preferential treatment the board granted was a failure. Transmountain consistently maintains that an average of 5 tankers per month are loaded at the West Ridge dock. The NEB repeated this figure in its report. Facts show this has not been accurate since 2010. There were fewer than 3 tankers a month in 2015 and only 32 for that full year. There were fewer than 2 tankers a month in 2016, and in June, the most recent month the statistics are available, there were none. Tankers that have been loaded at Westridge are destined for US markets, not Asian. Commodity export statistics confirm this. In 2010, only 6 tankers in Canada were loaded with diluted bitumen destined for non-US ports. In 2014, 2 of them went up the St. Lawrence River destined for Italy. Suncor delivered the diluted bitumen by rail. This year, with the diluted bitumen exports to non-US markets recorded during the first 6 months, there might not even be the equivalent of 1 Aframax tanker loaded by year-end. Now, if markets don't exist, why would crude oil producers sign 20-year take-or-pay contracts representing about $2 billion each of liability? Shippers have only ever said they want the opportunity to develop markets, not that they exist. When they signed up to ship on Transmountain's expansion in 2012, crude oil prices were more than double what they are today, and supply prospects were strong. Market conditions have seriously deteriorated. Since January 2014, oil sands producers have canceled or put on hold almost 2.7 million barrels a day of previously announced future production. Well, why then are producers continuing to support the project if their market prospects have tanked? The short answer is they are contractually obligated to support the project through the regulatory process. They must say they want the project to proceed, even if they don't. If the board had read the contracts, it would know this, but the board never asked Transmountain to file them. The board maintains that if evidence is not filed on the hearing record by the party that prepared it and can speak to it, the panel will not consider it. So the board relied on hearsay from Transmountain rather than making sure they understood what the contracts say and what they mean. During the more than 2 years the review was ongoing, the board asked the oil companies who signed the contracts one question. In July 2015, they were asked to provide their crude oil supply forecast and discuss whether the lower price environment affected their financial commitment to the project. But instead of providing updated supply projections as asked, the oil producers refused. Now, they cited commercial confidentiality, even though they have and do reveal supply intentions to their shareholders, and they have and do announce changes in their intended supply projections to media. Every year, these same oil producers willingly submit their future supply intentions to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers so CAP can produce its annual supply outlook. But when requested to provide updated supply intentions that reflect market-changed conditions by the National Pipeline Regulator, they refused. The oil producers simply told the board, and I quote, "The current lower price environment has no impact on the long-term financial commitment that these shippers have made to this project." Well, of course it doesn't. There is nothing in their contract that would allow shippers to walk from the project based on market conditions. It's a non-answer. If the board had read the contracts, it would know this. Market conditions were then and are now severely impacting Alberta's oil producers' future supply. The board pretends in its report that they are not. The NEB report refers to a $5.5 billion capital project. Everyone except the NEB knows that Kinder Morgan raised the project's capital cost to $6.8 billion. This happened almost a year ago. The board did not ask Kinder Morgan to provide an updated capital cost during the hearing. Why? Because it avoids obvious questions, and the board didn't want the answers. Higher capital costs mean increased toll rates, and increased toll rates give the oil producers an out from their contracts. but they can only exercise this out after the project has been approved and Kinder Morgan has its NEB certificates in hand. The board didn't want to consider the possibility that shippers might be free to walk because the board used the firmness of the contracts as their central reason for justifying project need. Increased toll rates from higher capital costs also reduced the price oil producers receive for their crude. The board's refusal to recognize the revised capital cost allowed it to accept overstated price lift benefits and allowed it to pretend that the project will lead to a reduction in Canadian crude discounts. A reduction in crude discounts was the second major benefit the board cited for this project. They even put a price on it. With accurate toll rates from the higher capital cost, Mr. Ernest's price lifts fall by almost 80%. The remaining 20% disappear because facts show price discounts for Canadian crude are within the normal range. They have nowhere to be further reduced. What the board doesn't say in its report is that diluted bitumen always sells at a discount. It is a lower quality crude and costs more to refine. It also costs more to transport by pipeline because it's so dense. The crude discount, the lower price, is there because the discount takes quality considerations and transportation costs into account. According to an NEB research report, the normal discount that the board expects is about $20 US a barrel. A discount of less than $20 US per barrel is considered a premium price for Alberta's heavy oil. Discounts below the dotted line on the graph represent a price premium. The average discount for the past year and a half was less than $14 US a barrel. Had the board checked crude oil prices, it would know there is no reduction in discounts for the project to capture, and hence the benefits are not there. The markets are not there, the crude discount benefits aren't there. So what about government revenues? Well, the board claims $28.2 billion over 20 years. Burnaby and other municipalities told the board that property tax revenues will not be enough to pay for municipal services required by the project or to compensate for the lost future planning and development options. That means the extra costs will be borne by taxpayers, property taxpayers who are resident in Burnaby. The board ignored them. Municipal costs related to the project are outside the scope of its review. The board pretends in its report that property tax revenue is a significant benefit. 84% of fiscal revenues from Mr. Ernest's non-existent price lifts, the reduction of the discount, 84% of the fiscal revenues come from that analysis. So the price lifts are not there, reduction in discounts are not there, so neither is the $23.7 billion in tax and royalty revenue related to it. Look at the project operations, $3.3 billion over 20 years. That comes from running the pipeline. 60% come from corporate income tax. That's $100 million a year because it's claimed Transmountain pays corporate taxes on operating profits. But Transmountain does not. Transmountain hardly pays any corporate tax at all. As an intervener, I asked Kinder Morgan questions about its corporate structure and tax planning. I wanted to test the evidence to show that the conference board's corporate tax estimates were grossly exaggerated. Instead of compelling Kinder Morgan to answer my questions so it could rely on facts, the board ruled my questions outside the scope of its review. For the 5 years from 2009 to 2013, and this is what Transmountain, Kinder Morgan told its shareholders in the US, they earned an average of $172 million a year in distributable cash flow. Now, that's the metric Kinder Morgan uses for profits. So on $172 million a year, it paid an average of $1.5 million in corporate tax and received a tax refund in 2 of those 5 years. This is the sophisticated tax planning Kinder Morgan will rely on for its expansion. When it does, it will hardly pay any tax at all. And we're supposed to believe that it's $100 million a year. So municipalities are concerned that the project represents a net cost. Fiscal revenues from price lifts, crude discount, do not exist, and corporate taxes from project operations are artfully avoided. The board also refused to look at fiscal revenue losses when other sectors like tourism and commercial fishing are negatively impacted by the project. The board said fiscal revenue losses in other sectors were outside the scope of its review. Finally, we are left with the board's jobs claim. There will be short-term construction employment related to the pipeline. Unifor and the Alberta Federation of Labour were the only labor organizations to intervene at the hearing. Unifor represents 12,000 energy sector workers and 5,000 West Coast commercial fishing workers, and the Alberta Federation of Labour represents 170,000 unionized workers in Alberta. These workers do not support the project. Unifor and AFL said there will be a greater number of job losses in construction and losses in permanent employment because the project robs our economy of value-added opportunity and crowds out existing activity, particularly in commercial fishing. The board ruled workers' concerns outside the scope of its review. Kinder Morgan told the board there will be 90 permanent jobs from operating the project. But the board didn't rely on this figure. The board relied on grossly exaggerated figures from a faulty input-output analysis done by the conference board so it could assert 443 permanent jobs instead. Under a proper scope of review, where an energy strategy for Canada and job losses across industries are considered, the jobs figures become negative. Facts show there are no existing Asian markets for Alberta's crude oil. It will take years to develop them. The demand is not there, and future supply is quickly disappearing. Crude oil producers can't be trusted because they are contractually obligated to only speak good of the project. There is no reduction in crude discounts to be captured. There is a likely net reduction in government revenues and net job losses. These are not greater than residual environmental burdens. Facts show the project should be rejected, but the board refused to consider the facts. The federal government is betraying Canadians by not living up to its promise to redo Transmountain's review. Canadians have not been given due process, and without due process, permission for Transmountain's expansion will never be given.